Maybe you've asked the question at some point in your life, how did I end up here? It's usually thought of maybe in connection with traveling. Maybe you took a wrong turn somewhere and thought you were following directions, but once you get off on one wrong turn, it's easy to take another one, and finally you get to a point where you just got to stop and look at the map or reset the GPS or whatever they do these days. But how in the world did I get here?
Never ask for directions.
Never ask for directions, right? I'm sure that's happened to me in life. Usually, I was thinking before I got up, I've answered that or asked that question a few times in mechanic work. You know, you start out to do a simple thing on a car and something breaks, and the next thing you know, you're miles away from where you intended to be. It probably happens more often with me with plumbing. I like building things, but plumbing is one thing that, if I plan one trip to Home Depot, it's always 3 before the day's done. And how in the world did I get in this mess? I wonder if King David ever asked that question in his life. We've been tracing the story of David for several weeks now, really since the first of the year, learning some lessons as we go, some good ones. Now we've come to maybe not so good ones. You see, the David here in the final chapters of the book of 2 Samuel is a far cry from the idealistic shepherd lad of faith who took on the Philistine giant Goliath. That was clear back in 1 Samuel 16 and 17. If you will, the golden era of David's life is starting to become a faded memory at this point in many ways. The story told in 2 Samuel 11 is much darker than the story about David and Goliath. To quote David's own words regarding the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, that happened in the first chapter, or really the last chapter of 1 Samuel, and then in the first chapter of 2 Samuel. We didn't cover it in these series of lessons, but David laments the deaths of Saul and Jonathan for different reasons, perhaps, but you may recall, if you know that section of Scripture, there's 2 or 3 times there in, I think it's chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, where David says, how the mighty have fallen, in reference to Saul and Jonathan. Well, those words came to my mind as I thought about the story of David and Bathsheba here in 2 Samuel 11. How the mighty have fallen. David's own words coming back to haunt him here. 2 Samuel 11, you can be open in your Bibles there. I think we're only going to be looking at that text this morning. I resisted the temptation to find 3 or 4 companion verses to go with every point. So you can stay in one place, breathing a sigh of relief, right? 2 Samuel 11 provides us with front row seats this morning to a sordid series of events in the life of King David. And they are sordid. That might be a mild term. To set the stage for us, David has consolidated his own rule over Israel following the death of Saul, right? David's no longer on the run for his life from King Saul. Saul has died, so now David is kind of getting everything back in place. God has promised to build David an enduring kingdom. That's 2 Samuel 7. That's a good study. David has engaged and defeated all external threats to his rule. Chapters 8 through about 10 just record battle after battle where David took his army out and basically was victorious over everyone. What could go wrong, right? What could go wrong? As we will see today, plenty here in chapter 11. The story in 2 Samuel 11 teaches us several lessons about the increasing dangers of sin. My guess is if you've lived long in the faith, you can probably think back to some series of events in your own life that say, you know what, this rings true. And that's, again, why I had Finn read those verses from James. You know, lust gives birth to sin, and sin gives birth to death. It's kind of a downward spiral that David's on one here in 2 Samuel chapter 11. I told everybody else to get to that spot in their Bible. I better do it myself. All right? Take my own advice. Again, it would be good just if we, why do we have to talk about these kind of things about the great King David? But the Bible doesn't pull any punches, even with its heroes. That's one mark of inspiration, if you will. See, if we were telling the story, we might leave this story out, right? If David's our hero, why bring up the skeletons out of the closet? Well, God doesn't shrink back from that. However great a man David was, he had his flaws, and they're front row here in this chapter. Let's look at several of these lessons about the increasing dangers of sin. First of all, sin often takes root in the unguarded moments of life. Sin often takes root in the unguarded moments of life. There in verse 1 of chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, it says, "Then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem." David stayed at Jerusalem. See, I think David's descent, if you will, into sin started innocently enough, I suppose. I don't want to read too much into this verse, and maybe I am. You can judge for yourself. But again, I don't want to read too much into it, but it does seem like a contrast is being made right away at the start of this chapter. I think purposely made, perhaps. David, if you will, was deviating from the normal routine, and sometimes that can make one vulnerable, more vulnerable than they would normally be. In my version puts it in this way. It was the time of year when kings go out to battle. You see, it was the king's job to take the armies out. But for one reason or another, and we're not told why, but it says David stayed behind at Jerusalem. My version says, but David. And there you have, that could be translated and maybe again, there's not more going on there or not, but it does seem. David says, you know what, we're going to do things differently this spring. I'm going to stay home. Nothing wrong with staying home. But in this case, it provides an opportunity for something, again, much worse. And it happens in our lives. Those unguarded moments of life, when we let our guard down, sin takes advantage of those times. It's not that we can't be tempted in the normal routines of life. We can. You could be going, David could have went out and led his armies out that spring and still be tempted. So I'm not saying you can't be. That happens all the time. But when things aren't normal, when you get out of your rut, if you will, the temptations of life can be more of a threat. For one reason or another, we let our guard down and temptations can seem more attractive. Sin often takes root in the unguarded moments of life. But that's not all. We also read in the story in verses 2 through 5 that sin gains strength when it goes unchecked. Sin gains strength when it goes unchecked. Let's read verses 2 through 5 of our text. David stayed home. Now, when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David sent messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, "I am pregnant." That's a whole other level now, isn't it, of the story? We see, if you will, the sin gaining strength. Once the temptation presented itself, and I'm not going to cast much aspersion on Bathsheba here, right? My guess is, and the text nowhere condemns her for this, for what she's doing. She's perhaps not parading herself for everyone to see, but David sees her. He's up on, the king's house is going to be higher than anybody else's house, so he's looking down and sees this woman bathing. We're not here to talk about Bathsheba. We're here to talk about David. But once the temptation presented itself, David had several opportunities to stop the train before it gained a head of steam, didn't he? Right? David could have looked and seen something he shouldn't be resting his eyes on. And he said he could at that moment turned away and says, nope, not going there. But he didn't. He didn't do it. After first seeing Bathsheba, again, he could have averted his eyes, but he didn't. What did he do? He says, let's find out more about this woman. He sent someone to inquire. He inquired about her. Who is this beautiful lady? After the inquiry, and upon learning that she was someone else's wife, guess what? There was another crossroads. David could have said, all right, I know who she is, and she's someone else's wife, so not going there. But he didn't do it. He sent and had her brought to him. Pretty hard to say no to the king. After Bathsheba arrived, he could have come to his senses and sent her back home. Maybe in a moment of more lucid thinking, he says, no, we got to stop this now. He didn't. He had sexual relations with another man's wife and then sent her home. At any point along the way in this story, this part of the story, David could have come to his senses, confessed his sin, and it would have went no farther. But he didn't. See, sin gains strength when it goes unchecked. Got to watch for those times when maybe your conscience says, stop here before it gets worse. But boy, in those times of temptation, it's hard to say no. Once the train starts rolling downhill, it gets harder for the brakes to stop it. Third, sin naturally leads to other sins. Have you ever had that happen in life? Maybe, I told a white lie over here. We designate, white lie's not as bad as a black lie or whatever. But we start to think about that, and the next thing you know, you're on down the road. Sin naturally leads to other sin. Let's read verses 6 through 13 now. It says, then David sent to Joab. Okay, now he's had relations with another woman. Now she's pregnant. What are we going to do now? David's thinking. Then David sent to Joab, that's his commander in the army, saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. This is Bathsheba's husband. He's been out at war in the spring. So Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked concerning the welfare of Joab and the people and the state of the war. When I read that, I think, yeah, that's really what's on your mind, isn't it, King David? How's things going? He's just stalling until he gets to what he really wants to deal with. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah went out of the king's house, and a present from the king was sent out after him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all of the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. Now when they told David, saying Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are all camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? By your life and by the life of your soul, I will not do this thing. Then David said to Uriah, stay here today also, and tomorrow I will let you go. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now David called him, and he ate and drank with him, and he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie in his bed with his Lord's servants, but did not go down to his house. So what's David trying to do here? Cover his tracks. It's going to take more sin to cover up the sins he's already neck deep in. Now that David's temptation has become David's sin, other questions arise. What if word gets out now? People are going to know Uriah's at war and his wife is pregnant. How can I keep this quiet? The damage, you see, has been done. Now it becomes what? Damage control. David is plotting, well, I'll send Uriah home, and the people will think, well, this is Uriah's child, not mine. However, he's reasoning in his mind. But one sin leads to another. We've been tracking it, right? Lust became adultery. Started out with lust, now it's adultery. Adultery now leads to deceit. Now we've got other innocent people being drawn into this web David is weaving as he tries to cover his sinful tracks. Sin naturally leads to other sins, unless it's stopped. Fourth, sin takes us down roads that we never thought possible. Sin takes us down roads that we never thought possible. Let's read 14 through 17. Getting worse, isn't it? Now in the morning, David said, Uriah's not, what a time in life to run into a fellow with principles, right? Uriah says, I'm not going to home while my fellow soldiers are still out in battle. What a time. Verse 14, now in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. There's an irony. Uriah is carrying, if you will, his own death sentence. David had written in the letter saying, place Uriah in the front line of the fiercest battle and withdraw from him so that he may be struck down and die. So it was, as Joab kept watch on the city, that he put Uriah at the place where he knew there were valiant men. The men of the city went out and they fought against Joab, and some of the people among David's servants fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. So things have gone from bad to worse for David. Uriah, again, unwittingly, didn't cooperate with the king's deceptive plans. Uriah is doing the right thing, getting in David's way of doing the wrong things. Once again, David, the sinner, is at a crossroads. He's been at several crossroads in this story, and any time he could have turned back. Now he's at an even more deadly one. David could confess and put an end to this mess, but he didn't. Instead, he moves on to adding murder to his ever-growing list of sins. Did David ever think it would get this bad? I'm guessing at the beginning of all this mess, looking down off a roof at a woman bathing and lusting in his heart after her. Did David, in his wildest dreams, ever thought it would end with him, saying, I want to have this guy murdered to cover my tracks? Probably he wouldn't have thought so. Could it ever get this bad? I doubt it, but here he is. Here he is. Sin takes us down roads that we've never thought possible. That's why it's so dangerous. That's not the end. Let's read on. Fifth, sin hardens our heart. This may be even the greater danger in all of this. The deeper you get into the mess, the harder, if you will, David's heart gets. Let's read 18 through 25. Then Joab sent and reported to David all the events of the war, and he charged the messenger, saying, when you have finished telling all the events of the war to the king, and it happens that the king's wrath rises, and he says to you, why did you go so near to the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who struck down Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? See, Joab knows just exactly how David's going to react to this news from the war. What in the world were you thinking, Joab, sending men so close to the wall? He knows David's going to be mad. But Joab, of course, he says to this messenger, he says, now I expect David to get angry here, but when that happens, you shall say to him, the end of verse 21, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Oh, now I remember why this is happening, maybe going through David's mind. So the messenger departed and came and reported to David all that Joab had been sent to tell. The messenger said to David, the men prevailed against us and came out against us in the field, but we pressed them as far as the entrance of the gate. Moreover, the archers shot at your servants from the wall, so that some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. Now, I'm flabbergasted every time I read verse 25 in this story. Notice what David says. Then David said to the messenger, thus you should say to Joab, do not let this thing displease you. For the sword devours one as well as another. Make your battle against the city stronger and overthrow it, and so encourage him. David gets news about the battle line. Regarding the fate of Uriah, things go as planned. But again, did you catch something else? In David's efforts to cover his tracks and have Uriah killed, Uriah wasn't the only one that died in this plan, right? There were others that were struck down, just so Uriah would die. Other innocent people, victims associated with David's sins. Surely there was some sense of regret or remorse on the part of the king now, right? If anything's going to turn his heart, surely this will do it. Nope. There's none. David, if you will, is so wrapped up in himself and his sins by this time in the story that all he can say in response to the needless deaths of Uriah and the other soldiers is, well, don't let it bother you. These things happen in war, right? That's the way it goes. How callous. That's why I say sin hardens our heart. You know, the farther David's walked down this road, these kind of things are not penetrating now. That's, it's the way the ball bounces. People get hurt, people kill. It's war. David's heart is hard. Finally, again, you think, well, surely that's the end of this sordid tale. Nope. We also see that sin blinds us to the truth. Sin blinds us to the truth. There's two more verses in this chapter. Let's read them. It says, now when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. When the time of mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. Evil in the sight of the Lord. So as the dust settles on David's descent into the depths of sin, not only has his heart been hardened, but his vision apparently has also been affected. Bathsheba is mourning the death of her husband, but the text records no mourning on the part of David. It's not included here, right? You don't get a shred of there's any sense of remorse in the king's heart. The only connection for mourning, or for David with mourning, was him waiting for it to be over so that he can bring Bathsheba into his own home as a wife. To this point in the sordid tale, David has somehow justified all his actions in his own eyes. That's what sin does. The farther we go into it, the more we add to our sins to cover up of this sin. You become so self-centered, you become blind to it after a while. David somehow has justified all of these actions in his own eyes. He's only seeing what he wants to see. Sin blinds us to the truth, and David's sins were blinding him. But I don't want to leave the story before we make this point. You see, there were another set of eyes, if you will, on the situation, wasn't there? And God's view was vastly different. Did you catch that last phrase in the chapter? My version says, but the thing that David had done, the things, if you will, that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. That's God's perspective. It was all evil in the sight of God. The bottom line here is that God's eyes really are the only ones that matter. See, the road into the depths of sin is dangerous and yet often traveled in life. You think you'd read a story like this and you'd want to say, well, I would never do that. Well, hopefully not. Again, maybe we can think of examples in our own lives where we've kind of trod the same path, one sin leading to another, and we end up like where we asked at the beginning, how in the world did I end up here? That moment's going to come for David in chapter 12. But I do want you all to remember this morning, before you start down that path, remember what we've learned today from the experience of David. Go through them right quick. Sin often takes root in the unguarded moments of life. Sin gains strength when it goes unchecked. Sin naturally leads to other sins. Sin takes us down roads we never thought possible. Sin hardens our hearts and blinds us to the truth. To stop there, the story sounds all pretty bleak at this point, doesn't it? But thankfully, this isn't the end of the story. Lord willing, next week in chapter 12, David is confronted about his sins and given an opportunity to repent. And that's the good ending to this story. But we're going to stop here today because I want us to think carefully about these things. Again, Lord willing, we'll talk about the other later. But I don't want to stop today without affirming that there is hope for anyone here today that realizes that David's story is their own story. Okay? There's hope for David. And there's hope for you and I if we followed in David's footsteps, not maybe the direct same sins, but whatever path, there's hope. Yes, one sin led to another, and before you knew it, you were in over your head, and you've been living with the thought that maybe you were beyond redemption. See, that's the other danger when you go down this road. You finally are sitting in the mess that you've made of your life, and maybe other innocent victims. You say, well, you know what? I just will give up. There's no hope for me now. I'm beyond redemption. Let me encourage you not to believe that lie. There is hope. The blood of Christ can make, as we sing, the vilest sinner clean. It's going to cleanse David before it's all done. It's the same blood of Christ that offered the Saul of Tarsus, who had traveled down a road that was horrible, that had offered him sin. If he repented and turned from them things, there's hope in the blood of Christ. But the sinner who would be forgiven, ladies and gentlemen, is the sinner who is willing to humble themselves before the Lord, repenting of and confessing their sin, and participating in the spiritual cleansing that comes in the waters of baptism. You see, that's the hope that God holds out for the one who's traveled the sin road. I would ask you the question today, is that you? Is that me? You need to grab the lifeline that God has offered through his Son, Jesus Christ. If you are, please come as we stand and sing.